Greetings, lovers of lore. Thank you for joining me for the final installment of the Dominaria United storyline main story. So, we are starting out with the Coalition. Teferi is the general of the Coalition, and when the story starts, he is talking with Karn. He's found a second Phyrexian who's been tampering with the food stores, and Joyra is checking on them, but dinner has been canceled. So there are a lot of irritable people. Now, Karn at this point had not managed to figure out who the Phyrexian spy was, and they were still waiting on Jaya, Joda, and Ajani's return. Karn wondered to himself, had Sheoldred found them? At this point, Joyra had managed to rig the self-destruct. The mana rig was far too valuable to allow it to fall into Phyrexian hands. The mana rig can be used to generate power stones and also to manufacture Thran metal, which is almost indestructible. And the last thing that the Alliance wanted, and the last thing that the Coalition wanted, was the Phyrexians having access to this Thran metal. So Teferi asks Karn about the Silex. Have you managed to finish your research yet? And it turns out that Karn had finished his research at this point, but he's genuinely afraid that not only might there be a spy on the mana rig, there might actually be some sort of artifact that allows for remote listening. So he is hesitant to say that he is actually ready to go. He hadn't had the opportunity to fully search the mana rig, and even if he had, a Phyrexian agent could have simply placed another device. But at that point, an alarm goes off, and all of the troops mobilize. Teferi and Karn go to have a look, and it is disastrous. Outside of the mana rig, there is an undulating sea of Phyrexians as far as the eye can see. Mana cannons are armed and prepared and fixed on the Phyrexian invaders, but it takes time for them to be ready. While the Viashino and goblins are readying these cannons, the Phyrexian sea opens up, and our gargantuan Phyrexian dreadnought rears back, but the cannons aren't ready. Obviously, that didn't matter to the Phyrexians, and they surged forth. The Phyrexian sea broke upon the mana rig. The first wave of them used ladders and grappling hooks, and the elves and humans and other members of the Coalition were busy pushing the ladders off, hacking the grappling hooks down, and doing everything they could to stop the Phyrexians from getting up onto the mana rig. The Phyrexian dreadnought bellowed and started heading towards the mana rig, crushing Phyrexians underfoot as it made its way forward. Teferi tells all the cannoneers that as soon as the cannons are ready to go, you are to fire on the dreadnought. Joyra comes running up from the lower deck and starts making the final adjustments on all of the cannons. They end up being readied, and Joyra gives the command, fire, with a wave of her hand. The cannons blast blue energy straight into the dreadnought, smashing a hole in the armor in its chest, but ultimately that's not enough to stop it. So Joyra brings her hand down again, and another wave of energy slams into the dreadnought. Now this is enough to take it down, and the beast stumbles to its side and falls, crushing a ton of Phyrexians underneath it. At this point, the Weatherlight comes soaring in, and Karn heaves a sigh of relief until he realizes that it's actually sending sickly green blasts of energy down amongst the Coalition. Elves and humans are being obliterated right before his eyes, and he realizes what he's seeing is a completed Weatherlight. It has been horribly transformed, and Karn was there at the birth of the Weatherlight. He spent many nights communing with it, so this is absolutely horrific to him. And the Weatherlight swings low, and Phyrexians rain down from its hull. There's a whole variety of different completed Dominarians, cat people, bear men. So Karn moved to defend the cannons, and suddenly a four-armed Phyrexian leaped down from the Weatherlight. It was Ertai. It's been a long time, Karn. Karn was amazed. This was definitely the real Ertai, right down to his mannerisms, not some animated corpse. And high up above them, at the same time, a flight of blue dragons led by Daragaz descended down upon the Weatherlight. Now, the Weatherlight managed to dodge the flames of the blue dragons, but Daragaz leaps directly on the Weatherlight and he starts clawing out its insides, Phyrexian gore raining down on the battle below. Back down on the ground, Ertai and Karn engage in battle. Ertai is enraged. He's furious about being left behind by the crew of the Weatherlight. And also, he's jealous of Karn. Why does Sheoldred care so much about Karn? Why does Elish Norn want Karn? So he sends a blast of light at Karn. Now, Karn, being the powerful planeswalker that he is unconcerned. He's set up a bunch of different warding magic that he is supremely confident can handle anything that Ertai is going to throw at him. But unfortunately, it turns out that Ertai is more than prepared for Karn. Karn finds this out when he's paralyzed by that ray of magic. And Ertai smirks at him and explains, I've redesigned myself specifically to fight you, Karn. And then he raises his arms up and he lifts Karn up in the air and starts to exert insane pressure on Karn's body. And the metal of Karn's frame starts to crumple and dent under the pressure. And he feels waves of pain radiating throughout his body. At the same time, it started to ice over. His metal body started contracting due to the contrast between the extreme cold and the desert heat of Shiv around them. But that wasn't enough for Ertai. He starts to pull off Karn's arms and legs, and Karn can feel his joints crumpling under the strain. Ertai was ecstatic in his triumph, but Karn decided if he was gonna die, he was gonna protect the Sylex. So he reached through the blind eternities to the workshop where the chest with the Sylex was and started encasing it with layer after layer of titanium. He only stopped when he was interrupted by a massive smashing. The golden Argosy flew into view, and a Johnny leapt down off of it, swinging his massive blade at Ertai, causing Ertai to leap backwards and then lose his balance and fall off of the mana rig. Karn was broken. He couldn't stand. He looked up at a Johnny. We must protect the Sylex. It's in the workshop. Ajani nods and starts laying into the Phyrexians with his axe. The golden Argosy lands on the mana rig, crushing a bunch of Phyrexians underneath it, and then Jaya, Danitha, and Radha charge out of the ship, leading both Keldon warriors and Benelish knights into the battle, and they start to slaughter Phyrexians. Jaya is whipping lightning around, blasting the Phyrexians, and then at the edge of the mana rig, Sheoldred rises into view, and she has a new body now. It's made of an ancient Dominarian dragon engine, and she looks at Karn laying there and tells him to give her the Sylex. And Johnny turns to Jaya and says, go get the Sylex. We have to get it out of here. And Jaya nods and runs off to get it. At that point, Sheoldred moves closer to the mana rig, and as she's doing so, she's pulling Phyrexians up into her body, and they're actually combining with her, becoming part of the massive construct that supports her. Using the incredible bulk of her body, she slammed into the mana rig. There was a boom that sounded throughout, and then Sheoldred slammed her legs down into the ground so that the Phyrexians down there could use them as ramps, and they started to swarm upwards onto the mana rig. Karn lay where he had been moved against the workshop door, mangled and unable to do anything. He was incredibly concerned. Why had he not felt Jaya planeswalk away yet? His body was so ruined that he couldn't even form a fist anymore. All he could do was lay against the door and crush Phyrexians that came near with his hands. His spirit sunk lower when reinforcements for the Phyrexians arrived in the form of 2 more dreadnoughts. Teferi told the cannoneers, prepare the cannons! But Ajani was troubled. I don't think we can overcome this. But at that point, Daragaz and his flight of blue dragons appear yet again, and Daragaz jumps right onto one of the dreadnoughts and starts ripping the scales off of it and tearing it apart. Hot on their tail was the Weatherlight, shooting green sickly blasts, harrying the dragons. And then there was a shuddering in the mana rig and a thrum that everybody could feel. And Karn realized that Joyra had just used the Heartstone and awakened the mana rig. And then the mana rig stood up on giant metal legs, Phyrexians tumbling off of the edges. Sheoldred's body fell away, and the mana rig started crushing Phyrexians underfoot as it started to run away. At the same time, it's scooping up loads of rock, superheating them, melting them into lava, and spewing it all over the Phyrexians below. This was too much for the Phyrexians, and they pulled back. But at that moment, the Magnagoth trees and the elves arrived, and they started smashing the Phyrexians from behind. Maria and Joda fly in on a winged Kevu, and Joda throws a magical shield up around the cannons to protect them. And the defenders realize they've been saved at the last moment. Jaya came out with the Silex box. She was basically dragging it out. I can't planeswalk with this myself. It's too heavy. Karn hadn't considered what would happen if a regular human tried to carry the box. So he stripped away the outer layers of titanium and opened the locks on the chest. And the chest swung open, revealing the Silex with its runes glowing. Finally, a mechanical voice said, that sounded surprisingly like a Johnny. Everyone turned to a Johnny. His skin was pulsing and fluctuating, and his one good eye widened in horror. And at that moment, his body tore open to reveal all kinds of Phyrexian cables dripping with oil. A Johnny had been the spy. A Johnny was the betrayer. A Johnny had been completed. Jaya clutched the Silex and took a step back, pulling up a wave of fire magic and sending it spinning around her to protect herself. But it made no difference. A Johnny slammed his double-headed axe straight into her, and she fell to the ground like a crumpled doll. Teferi cast slowing magic on a Johnny while Karn charged forward. But ultimately the magic wasn't enough, and a Johnny cut straight through Karn's body with his axe like Karn's body was made of flesh. A Johnny cut so deep that his axe got embedded in Karn's body. Karn was left in agony, trying to yank it out with his broken limbs. And Teferi was drained from the effort of slowing a Johnny. So a Johnny walked by Teferi like he was nothing, and he picked Jaya up by her neck. She grabbed onto his wrist and said, "I'm not dying alone." And at that, flames sprung up along his wrist and quickly spread along the hair of his body, setting him alight. It burned away all of his flesh and his skin, leaving only the metal and wiring cables of his Phyrexian underlying nature. It had no effect on a Johnny. He tossed her body off of the mana rig like it was nothing. Teferi and Joda cried out. Karn was heartbroken, but he was focused on the Silex. He could see it where Jaya had dropped it, but he couldn't move towards it. A Johnny leaned down, picked up the Silex, and crushed it in a single hand. The runes on the Silex flared and winked out, and along with it, Karn's hope died. Just then, Sheoldred manages to use her massive body to slam the mana rig up against a mountain, and while it's pinned there, Phyrexians are leaping down off the mountaintop, pouring onto the mana rig. The coalition was hard-pressed. Sheoldred detached her humanoid half and climbed up onto the mana rig. She said to Karn, "We have big plans. This is the next step in our evolution." But a voice emanated from deep in the mana rig. It was Joyra's voice. "You're in for a big disappointment." And that was followed by an ominous ticking. She had just activated the self-destruct mechanism of the mana rig. The golden Argosy immediately flew away. Joda started whipping up magical portals to get everyone to safety. And he was just throwing them anywhere he could see people. Some people just getting sucked in by being close enough, and the others getting shoved in by people who were smart enough to know, we have to get out of here. So everybody gets evacuated except for poor Karn, who's still in a Johnny's grip with Sheoldred there laying with her hand right on his chest. And she speaks into the air, "Targets acquired, we're ready to return." And then a scarlet light envelops them. And a moment later, They're gone. Teferi and Joyra were left with the task of organizing the survivors. Teferi finds Joda holding Karn's necklace and a lock of Jaya's hair. You have to eat. You have to sleep. But Joda's too broken. All he says is, she can't be gone. At that point, Joyra shows up. We have living friends who need us. And they decide they're going to build a memorial. The memorial is a number of white pyramids around an ever-burning fire that hovers in mid-air. And these pyramids were imbued with memories of Jaya. One was left empty for when Karn returned, so he could also place his memories of her in there. After this, everyone returned to their respective homes to recover, with the exception of Teferi. Jaya had in a secret pocket in her clothing the actual documentation about the Silex, and using those plans, the artificer Saheeli was able to make a perfect copy of it. However, they lacked the knowledge of how to activate the Silex, so they made the decision that Teferi was going to go back in time to learn how to activate the Silex. So he traveled with Saheeli to Urza's tower and used a magical device there to amplify his power and send him back in time. Now for Karn, when that red light faded, he was in a cavern, no longer on the mana rig. And there was a white light above, and in front of him was Elish Norn. She was gloating. "Welcome home, father," she said with a smile. He noticed they were on a platform together above a huge amount of Phyrexian worshippers. And she said, "You deserve to share in our glory." Karn was too broken to move, so Norn forced him to look down at the ground where a tiny little sapling was growing. And Karn asked what it was, and Norn said, "That's the beginning of everything." And that ends the story of Dominaria United. I hope that you enjoyed it. But the good news is, now that Teferi's going back in time, we know that this has to do with the upcoming Brothers' War. And if you want to know the entire story of the Brothers' War, great news! The videos are already on this channel. So you can actually continue along right from here straight into them. And then when the set comes out, you'll already know everything you need to know about the past for when we do the set that is the blend of both the present and the past. It's going to be epic. So, if you love what we're doing here, join the Patreon or the channel membership. Thanks for coming by. Big thank you to our patrons. And remember, my friends, lore is life.